Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. This is our fourth session of our spring semester of Emerald Ash Borer University. And today we are hosting Dr. Sarah Short, who's going to be talking about her research with invasive mosquitoes. So, Sarah, please take it from here.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Entomology here at OSU. And my lab mostly focuses on mosquito microbe interactions. So we do a lot of basic biology research, looking at how mosquitoes interact with microbes and the ways we might be able to use bacteria or fungi to understand or prevent mosquito-borne disease transmission. I also teach courses on vector biology, vector meaning insects that move pathogens from one host to another. And I also teach a course on insect pathology. And then I have an extension program as well, and most of my extension work is focused on tick-borne disease and tick bite safety. But I also do a little bit of extension about mosquitoes, and that's why I'm here today. I want to say that my ability to be here with you today is funded through a NIFA grant, which is at the bottom of this screen, so I want to acknowledge their funding. And I also wanted to say that at the end, there will be a survey, and I would ask you to please complete the survey because we need to get feedback in order to provide the USDA with information on what we're doing with their grant dollars. So we really appreciate your feedback. Also, I use it to improve my talks, so it's very much appreciated. Okay, so this talk today is about invasive mosquitoes and their implications for human health around the world and also for us as Ohioans. Give me 1 second. All right, so here's an outline of my talk. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about basic mosquito biology, hopefully some stuff that you don't know, probably some stuff you already do, but just to give everybody on the same page. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about mosquito-borne disease transmission. So how do mosquitoes transmit disease, and what diseases do they transmit, both in Ohio and then globally. And then I'm going to tell you about two invasive mosquitoes that are invasive around the world, but also in the United States, and the problems that they cause. And those we'll talk about are Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito, and Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito. And then at the end, I'll give you a few tips, again, some that you probably already know, but maybe some you don't, about mosquito bite prevention and how we can control mosquito populations. All right, so let's start with some basic mosquito biology. So mosquitoes belong to the order Diptera. So this is the same order that flies belong to. You can tell that they're flies because they only have two wings. So di meaning two, ter meaning wing. And they have, so they lay eggs, and then their immature stages are aquatic. So mosquitoes lay eggs that hatch into larvae. And then those larvae undergo multiple molts until they get to fourth instar, at which point they pupate. And then the pupae are also aquatic. And then when the pupa is done developing into an adult, the pupa goes to the surface of the water, it cracks down the back, and the adult climbs out of the pupa and flies away. The adults are the only terrestrial stage of mosquitoes. So male and female mosquitoes are shown here. So this is a female mosquito on the top, and this is a male mosquito on the bottom. These are Culex mosquitoes. We have these around here. They're Culex pipiens. So they're delicate gnat-like flies, and they have scales on their wings. And they use piercing, sucking mouthparts to feed on humans and on nectar from plants. So this is a female at the top, and this is her proboscis, which is the business end that she uses to bite us and to suck blood. But you can tell a female apart from a male because males, so if you look at the antennae on males, male antennae are very feathery, whereas female antennae right here are not. So they have a few little hairs that branch off of their antennae, but nothing like the males that have these really frilly antennae. So that's just a tip for being able to tell males apart from females, which you may wish to do because female mosquitoes are the only ones that bite. So females use blood from vertebrates in order to get proteins and lipids to produce eggs. And males don't bite at all. They're actually not capable of biting. They only feed on nectar and from flowers. So if you're ever bitten by a mosquito, you can be sure that it was a female mosquito that bit you. Sorry. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is what the life cycle of a mosquito looks like. So I mentioned these different life stages. So the adult female will lay eggs. Most species of mosquitoes lay eggs on the surface of the water. But I'm going to tell you about Aedes mosquitoes later in the talk, and they don't lay their eggs directly on water. They lay them on the sides of containers right above the water line. But this is a Culex mosquito that you're likely to see in Ohio, and she's laying eggs directly on the water. These eggs are white when she first lays them, but then they will darken over time. They become basically black in color. And these Culex mosquitoes actually glue them together into a little raft that is about the same shape and size as a mouse turd. So if you ever see little floating, what look like black mouse turds in your bird bath or something, they're probably Culex egg rafts, and you want to get them out of there. And then, as I mentioned, the eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae live in the water. They use this siphon here to breathe, so they go up to the surface and breathe through this siphon. And then they turn into pupae. The pupae are mobile, so they actually tumble and spin through the water. It's not like, you think of a pupa like a butterfly chrysalis, which is a quiescent state, and it's an immobile state, right? They're not moving at all. In the case of mosquitoes, they're very mobile, and they actually breathe through these little trumpets at the top. So this is the eye of the adult, and then the wing and the abdomen is wrapped up in here. And then the wing and the thorax is in here, and then this is the abdomen of the mosquito. So here's the adult, climbs out of the pupa and then flies away. All right, so why do I study mosquitoes? Why do we care about mosquitoes? We care about mosquitoes first and foremost because, not first and foremost, but we care about them because they're annoying. Their bites itch, and but they're not just obnoxious. They can actually negatively impact quality of life and result in less time spent outdoors. And this is true even in places where they're not transmitting a lot of disease. And I like this study from 2014 because they actually quantified a reduction in the amount of time spent outdoors as a result of mosquito bites. And I appreciate that because it's actually scientific evidence I can point to say that, the nuisance aspect of mosquitoes is substantial and it's something that we should pay attention to. But in addition to them being a nuisance, the primary reason that we care about them is because they transmit diseases that make people and animals very sick. People often call mosquitoes the deadliest animal in the world, but of course it's not the mosquito that's killing people, it's the pathogens that they transmit to us. Okay, so that was just a brief overview of mosquito biology. And I just mentioned that mosquitoes can transmit disease. So how exactly do they do this? So this is sort of a schematic of how mosquito-borne disease spreads in a population. So let's start here. Bob, can you tell me if you can see my cursor if I move it like this?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay, maybe what I'll do is if I can get whoops, oh dear. I was hoping for a laser pointer, but I'm not sure I can find that. That's okay. All right, so if we look at the red lightning bolt at the top of the circle, so this basically indicates a point at which a pathogen is being transmitted. So here we have, let's imagine that a mosquito is biting one of these people at the top of the circle. And those people, and the mosquito is transmitting a pathogen. So the people that just got bit by a mosquito, now they have become infected by, let's say, a virus or a parasite, depending on what the mosquito is spreading. And then the people who got infected, they, depending on the pathogen, they may become, the pathogen will spend some time in the person and it will replicate, and eventually it reaches a point where the person is now capable of spreading that pathogen to another mosquito. So if this person, so in red, we have basically infectious people who are capable of spreading a particular disease. If they get bit by another mosquito, then that mosquito picks up the pathogen. And then the pathogen actually goes into the mosquito and it spends time in the mosquito as well. And the mosquitoes, sorry, because I have some sort of auto timer there. The mosquito eventually will also then become infectious for the pathogen. So here we have an infectious mosquito. And then this mosquito can go on to bite another person who then becomes infectious, who spreads it to a mosquito, who then becomes infectious and spreads it to a person. And this continues the cycle. So mosquito-borne disease generally cannot be spread from person to person. Instead, what happens is that a mosquito needs to bite that person and carry the pathogen to the next person and inject it into that person. Now, this is a very simplified disease cycle. For many diseases, people are not the only ones involved. And in fact, what keeps the cycle going are other animals in the environment, like birds or small rodents or dogs or what have you. But there are actually many diseases, and I'll tell you about one of them a little bit later in the talk, that are only spread from person to mosquito to person because people can actually become infectious to the mosquito with those particular pathogens. Okay, so sometimes humans are the only host in a particular disease cycle. All right, so how do mosquitoes actually move a pathogen from one person to another? They do this using their piercing, sucking mouth parts, and then they use their bodies to fly and carry it. But they have very specialized mouth parts that allow them to suck our blood and also to transmit pathogens. So this is a close-up view of a mosquito mouth part. So when we look at a mosquito, all we see is a proboscis sticking out. But if you actually zoom in, there's actually multiple parts within that proboscis, and each of them has a different job. So when we see the proboscis, what we really see is this thick this thick component of it, which sort of holds all of the what are called stylets together. And this is called the labium. So here, this is a cross-sectional view if you like cut right through that. The labium is sort of like hot dog bun that holds all of the stylets. And then the stylets are inside. And so the mosquito has two very thin stylets called maxillae that have little knife-like serrated edges that she uses to cut the skin. And then she uses these mandibles here to hold the skin open. And then she inserts the labrum, which is right here, and she actually uses that to suck blood. And she also inserts this called a hypopharynx, which secretes saliva. So the mosquitoes suck your blood and spit into you at the same time. It's delightful. And the saliva is the dangerous part. So when a mosquito is infected with a virus or a parasite that can make us sick, that virus or parasite invades their salivary glands, which are right behind the head, and it gets into the saliva. So while they're feeding, they're spitting into you. And even though it's a very short period of time that they're feeding on you, that's enough time to spit a saliva that contains tons of virus or tons of parasites, and you can get an infection. And you can see in this image here, so these are the stylets that are being inserted into your skin, and this is the labium bent back. See, so most of what we see as the proboscis doesn't actually get inserted into our skin. Like most of the volume of it, it's actually these really skinny little stylets. This also allows it to not hurt nearly as much as if the mosquito was like jamming a really big mouth part into us or cutting a big hole in us, which is what like black flies do or horse flies. They just like rip our skin and let the blood pool and suck it up. But mosquitoes very delicately insert these stylets into our skin and can sometimes actually get them into a blood vessel directly and can drink blood directly from a blood vessel. So I have a little video I want to share of this, and you can tell me, hold on. Okay, hopefully. Now, Bob told me when I tested this that it was a little loud on his end, so you may wish to turn down the volume. just to start, and then you can turn it up and see if you can hear. It's a little quiet at the beginning, so it shouldn't be too bad. Or there's not much to hear at the beginning.
This is the deadliest animal in the world. Mosquitoes kill hundreds of thousands of people each year. The most vulnerable people, children, pregnant women. No other bite kills more humans or makes more of us sick. So what makes a mosquito's bite so effective? For starters, they're motivated. Only females bite us. They need blood to make eggs. And a pool of water for their babies to hatch in. Even a piece of trash can hold enough. At first glance, it looks simple, this mosquito digging her proboscis into us. But the tools she's using here are sophisticated. First, a protective sheath retracts. See it bending back? If you look at a mosquito's head under a microscope, you can see what that sheath protects. And inside there are 6 needles. 2 of them have tiny teeth. She uses those to saw through the skin. They're so sharp, you can barely feel her pushing. These other 2 needles hold the tissues apart while she works. From under the skin, you can see her probing, looking for a blood vessel. Receptors on the tip of one of her other needles pick up on chemicals that our blood vessels exude naturally and guide her to it. Then she uses this same needle like a straw. As her gut fills up, she separates water from the blood and squeezes it out. See that drop? That frees up space to stuff herself with more nutritious red blood cells. With another needle, she spits chemicals into us. They get our blood flowing more easily and give us itchy welts afterwards. And sometimes, before she fries herself away, she leaves a parting gift in her saliva. A virus or a parasite that can sicken or kill us. There's nothing in it for her. The viruses and parasites are just hitching a ride. But this is what makes mortal enemies out of us and mosquitoes. They take our blood. Sometimes we take theirs. But often not soon enough.
Okay.
Good, you're still there. Please.
No, we're not. Sorry. Okay. Just get back to my talk. I'm sorry. Okay, so I've been using the term mosquito very generally, but different mosquitoes spread different diseases. And not all mosquitoes are everywhere in the world, so not all diseases occur everywhere in the world. So for example, Anopheles mosquitoes, they transmit malaria, most famously to people. Malaria causes hundreds of thousands of deaths every year, mostly in children in sub-Saharan Africa. It also causes millions of infections. Aedes mosquitoes, which we will talk about in more detail because they have an interesting invasive species story. They transmit multiple viruses, and then Culex mosquitoes are another group of mosquitoes. So these are all genera of mosquitoes. So the genus Culex mosquitoes transmit pathogens as well. And we have Culex here in Ohio, and I'll tell you about some of the diseases that we have in Ohio that are transmitted by mosquitoes. Okay, so mosquitoes transmit basically every type of pathogen you can think of, with the exception of bacterial pathogens. They're not very good at that. But mosquitoes can transmit filarial nematodes or roundworms. So these cause things like canine heartworm or lymphatic filariasis. So we, on this slide, things highlighted in red are pathogens that are present in Ohio. So we actually see cases of these in Ohio. We don't have lymphatic filariasis, thank goodness, but this causes elephantiasis, and this is very widespread in the tropics. They also, as I mentioned, transmit malaria, which is a protozoan parasite. And then they also transmit tons of viruses. So we refer to these collectively as arboviruses, so arthropod-borne viruses. And we have multiple arboviruses in Ohio. Luckily, they're not very common. But for example, West Nile virus is our most common mosquito-borne disease in Ohio, and we have cases of West Nile most years. Some years are pretty bad, and we can get quite a few. We also have lacrosse encephalitis virus in Ohio, and actually we have one of the highest incidences in the country of lacrosse encephalitis virus. Most people don't know about it. It can be deadly, especially to children. Luckily, it's extremely rare, but these are examples of mosquito-borne diseases that we have in Ohio. Oh, I'm sorry. Click through this one more time. So here in purple, I've highlighted multiple viral pathogens that are transmitted around the world and also in the United States, but not in Ohio, by invasive mosquitoes. So I'm going to focus on these because, we're interested in invasive species, and that's the topic of the talk. So I'm talking about trouble that has been created by these invasive mosquitoes, some of which are some of the most successful invasive species on the planet. Viruses that have been caused by invasive Aedes mosquitoes are yellow fever virus, dengue virus, chikungunya virus, and Zika virus. And these are all transmitted by the same couple species of Aedes mosquitoes that I'll tell you about in a minute. But let's just hone in on one of these. Oh my goodness, sorry, I should have gone through this. Let's hone in on one of these viruses with a little bit more detail. So I want to focus just a little bit on dengue virus. Because it is the most common arbovirus in the world. So about 50% of the world's population is at risk of dengue, and its incidence has increased 30-fold in the past 50 years. So estimates for the number of cases of dengue per year range from 50 million to as high as almost 400 million cases per year, including 500,000 cases of severe dengue. And this is like a really dangerous disease. And tens of thousands of deaths per year on average. So this is distributed throughout the tropics. And you can see that dengue is basically, the entirety of the tropics has dengue transmission. So this graph, what is showing here is the environmental suitability for dengue. So if it's gray, it basically means there's no dengue. If it's red, it means it's an extremely suitable environment for dengue. And you can see that in the United States, we actually have multiple parts of the United States where there is like this reddish color indicating that it's very suitable for dengue. And indeed, if we zoom in and look in the United States, there are actually many cases of dengue, both in the mainland United States, so especially the southern tip of Florida. So this graph is showing cases over the last 15 years, and the numbers here are color-coded. Very small numbers in many parts of the country. Sorry, let me turn off the... jump ahead. Sorry, it's not letting... I can't find it in my web browser. I know how to do it in my... that's okay. All right. Well, sorry, if it jumps ahead, I'll just have to click back. I apologize for that if it's distracting. But you can see the southern tip of Florida has quite a few cases. And then most of the cases that we have in the United States occur in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has periodic epidemics of dengue, but there's always some dengue that occurs in Puerto Rico at all times. But they can have many cases in a given year, more than 10,000 in some instances. Okay, so we talked about mosquito-borne disease transmission, how they transmit disease, and the diseases that they transmit. So let's talk now a little bit more about the invasive species that cause these problems. And I'm going to specifically tell you about Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. They are responsible for transmitting dengue, as well as yellow fever, Zika virus, and chikungunya. And if you have questions about any of those other diseases, I can answer them at the end. So Aedes aegypti is shown right here in this picture. So this is the yellow fever mosquito, and she's named because she's the primary transmitter of yellow fever. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try using my not use my web browser so that we don't get that auto advancement. Hopefully it'll work. Sorry. So we're back. So Aedes aegypti. You can, Aedes aegypti in the adult form anyway is readily recognizable by the scaling pattern on the back. So it makes this, she has this little guitar shaped pattern on her back, or lyre, Lyre, that instrument. That's what people say, that it's shaped like that. Um, so Aedes aegypti is what's called a highly anthropophilic mosquito, meaning that she feeds almost exclusively on humans. So Aedes aegypti, many years ago, we don't exactly know when in evolutionary history, the species diverged into two subspecies, Aedes aegypti formosus, which is a forest-dwelling subspecies, and Aedes aegypti. And Aedes aegypti basically has become dependent on humans. So she feeds only on humans. She really has a very strong preference for humans. They are daytime biters, but their peak biting is crepuscular, so in the morning and the evening. And they actually hang out and bite people inside their dwellings. So this is what we call endophagic feeding behavior. So within, phage feeding. If you were doing field work, for example, to look for Aedes aegypti, it's common to actually go into people's homes, and you can find them, a few of them up in the corner of the living room, or possibly in the bathroom because it's humid in there. So they are, they're extremely, extremely anthropophilic. The human preference of Aedes aegypti makes them exceptionally good at transmitting mosquito-borne pathogens for which humans are the primary host. So when we have that simple transmission cycle where it just goes from person to mosquito to person to mosquito, that tends to be the case for when we have a transmission cycle of that nature, then mosquitoes that really like feeding on people get that cycle going and really tend to expand the incidence of those diseases. So for example, this is a map of Puerto Rico showing dengue cases during an epidemic that they had in the 2010s. And in red are all of the places where they had the most cases of dengue. And you can see on the bottom here is a map of the island. And in the red parts on the map are the urban centers of the island. So this is San Juan here in the north, in the northern eastern side of the island. And that's where we see most of the cases clustering, but we also see some in built up areas in the east and in the south. And this is because most dengue is found in urban centers, because we have these mosquitoes that like to feed on people, and then people are the only host involved in that transmission cycle. So this is really a disease of urban environments, which is not the case for many other mosquito-borne diseases, but it is for Aedes aegypti arboviruses. All right, another interesting aspect of Aedes mosquitoes. This is true for Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito that I'm telling you about now. It's also true for Aedes albopictus, I'll tell you about in a minute, and really for all Aedes, is that they can lay their eggs in above the water line, and the eggs can desiccate and just sit there, meaning they can dry out and they can just sit there for months. So you can have this ticking time bomb of these eggs. If you have a dry season, dry period, it doesn't matter for Aedes eggs. Aedes mosquitoes will lay their eggs, then they sit and dry out, and then when it rains, the eggs get inundated, and then they hatch, and you have tons and tons of Aedes mosquitoes. So this makes it very challenging to control these mosquito populations. Like, for example, we rear them in the laboratory. It's very convenient for us because we rear these mosquitoes in the laboratory and we throw the eggs in a baggie, and then we come back 3 months later and we hatch them, and ta-da, we have mosquitoes. But in the field, or like in natural environments, this is a really serious problem. Another thing that's very challenging about Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus is that they really like to lay eggs in man-made containers. So if you're thinking about a mosquito that likes to feed on people and that can spread disease in urban environments, if they also happily lay their eggs in things like tires, so these are pictures we took in the field in Florida. We found Aedes larvae in tires, in these the pans that you put under pots. This is enough water for larvae to thrive in. They do just fine. And even in these little spaces in this plastic kayak that we were sampling in, we found larvae in every single one of these little pools. So it's a big challenge. It's a challenge for control and for prevention, that these Aedes eggs can just sit and wait until the conditions are right, and then they hatch. All right, so Aedes aegypti is Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus are both among the most successful invasive species on the planet. So Aedes aegypti has expanded globally over the past 400 years or so. So originally, Aedes aegypti is from sub-Saharan Africa, and this is also where yellow fever originated. So Aedes aegypti was brought to the New World during the Atlantic slave trade. So in the 1500s, and it was well established by the 1600s. And there are recorded cases of the first yellow fever case in the mid 1600s. So we have evidence that these mosquito populations were very well established and were transmitting yellow fever in the 1600s in the New World. And then, so this study, this is what these researchers found and how they propose Aedes aegypti spread globally. So they believe, based on their study, so it was a population genetics study, and they believe, based on their study, that then Aedes aegypti was reintroduced to the old world, back into Europe into Europe in the 1800s, and then eventually it spread later in the 1800s into Southern Asia, and then eventually into the Pacific Islands. So Aedes aegypti has made its way out of Africa and then around to basically the entire tropics. And this is its current distribution. So this map predicts the probability of occurrence of Aedes aegypti. So blue means you're not going to find Aedes aegypti. 1 means Aedes aegypti would do very, very well in this location, and does do very well in this location. So what you can see is that it's basically the entirety of the tropics, with the exception of places that are potentially too dry to support mosquitoes because they need water, or potentially too hot because above like 40 degrees C, Aedes aegypti doesn't do so well. But Aedes aegypti is a tropical mosquito, so they cannot withstand cold temperatures. So they're really limited to warmer climates. And you can see that Aedes aegypti is predicted by this map, and indeed does very well in Florida and southern Texas, and it's also invaded southern California. So we have Aedes aegypti in many parts of the United States, and it's also in Puerto Rico, all over the island. Okay, so that's Aedes aegypti. So then a secondary vector, or a mosquito that secondarily transmits many of these diseases, is Aedes albopictus. You have probably seen Aedes albopictus in your backyard. I will talk to you about their global expansion in just a minute, but you can tell Aedes albopictus because they're a very dark black mosquito. They have stripy legs like many Aedes mosquitoes do, but they have this very distinctive single white stripe down the back of the thorax that is indicative and diagnostic of an Aedes albopictus mosquito. Okay, so they also have a preference to bite humans, but they are not nearly as anthropophilic as Aedes aegypti. So they are capable of transmitting the same diseases that Aedes aegypti transmits, but they're not as efficient at it, with a few exceptions that are not worth getting into here. They're also daytime feeders. Technically their peak biting is crepuscular, But if you've noticed these mosquitoes in your yard, it's because they will happily feed any time of day. And they're often called garden mosquitoes because they are what are called exophylic exophagic. So they feed and they rest outdoors. They're not seeking inside or indoor harborage the way that Aedes aegypti does. But basically, the minute you step close to your, shrubbery in your backyard, they're going to come out and start trying to bite you. They are extremely aggressive biters. So both Aedes albopictus and Aedes aegypti like to bite around the ankles. And if you're standing in your backyard and you quickly take a step back and look down, you're likely to see an Aedes albopictus trying to get at you. But they will just keep coming and coming. They're very aggressive biters. All right, they have also, and again, are also, and in fact, I would say even more successful of an invasive species than Aedes aegypti. They're also more recent in their spread. So this map is not the best map, but so they're indigenous to Southeast Asia, hence their name, their common name is the Asian tiger mosquito. So tiger for that stripy pattern, and then Asian because they originated from Asia. But in the 80s, and so in the early 80s, they were transported to the New World, likely through global shipping. We don't exactly know how they got to the Americas. They could have been shipped in used tires or movement of tires from one place to another. It's also thought that maybe ornamental plants might have played a role, movement of plants, but we don't entirely know. But we know that they showed up in the Americas in the 80s, and by the 2000s, they were pretty widespread. So you can see here that this graph, the legend shows yellow is the introduction in the 80s, and then in green is spread in the 90s, and then from 2001 to present are places that have picked up Aedes albopictus. So at first, this paper looked at the rapid expansion of Aedes albopictus and Aedes aegypti in the United States and Europe. And this is a portion of one of the figures from this paper. So in this figure, red indicates the most rapid spread of Aedes albopictus. And this is like the colors indicate kilometers spread per year with a range of confidence. So red basically means they spread incredibly quickly in that area. And then they spread to other places a little bit more slowly. And then this graph below shows the spread rate in kilometers per year by time. So what you can see is when they were first introduced, they sort of had this peak where they were spreading very, very quickly, and it started to dissipate. So essentially, they very quickly filled the available niches that they could in the southeastern United States. Excuse me. But they are still spreading slowly in the eastern United States. So Aedes albopictus is different from Aedes aegypti because it is a temperate mosquito. So it can overwinter very well. So it has been able to spread north, much more northward than Aedes aegypti ever was. It also displaced Aedes aegypti in a lot of places in the United States because, well, we don't entirely know why. We think probably it was at least partially competition for resources and that they were taking breeding sites that Aedes aegypti had previously utilized. But there were also reports of what was termed satyrization. So Aedes albopictus males can and do mate with Aedes aegypti females. But those mating events result in the female not laying any viable eggs. So the Aedes albopictus males, when they first invade a location, they will mate with other local Aedes mosquitoes, and that helps them establish. So in many pockets of the United States, we actually saw Aedes albopictus completely displace Aedes aegypti. But my understanding is that the satyrization behavior, basically the local population of Aedes aegypti adapts to that pretty rapidly. So there's initial satyrization events that happened, but that doesn't explain like the long-term displacement of Aedes aegypti that we've seen. So that's probably more competition for resources or habitat. Yes, and there is also So this from this paper in 2019, these people looked at predicted additional expansion of both Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. And both are predicted to expand further over the next few decades. So anywhere in red in the map that you see indicates predicted expansion of Aedes aegypti on the top and Aedes albopictus on the bottom. So in some places in blue, it's probably going to get a bit too hot for Aedes albopictus. So this is showing predictions from 2020 to 2050, given particular climate modeling values that I unfortunately am not recalling off the top of my head. But yeah, blue indicates areas of likely contraction, but red indicates areas of expansion. So Aedes albopictus is predicted to spread even more northward than it is already currently, and also to spread to more parts of California. Aedes aegypti is expected to expand in California, as well as throughout many parts of the eastern United States. So it's likely that we're going to see even more of these mosquitoes over time. Okay, so mosquitoes are terrible and we hate them. So what can we do to protect ourselves and to prevent mosquito-borne disease, both in Ohio and then also when you're traveling? So, you know, a lot of the name of the game is personal protection when it comes to mosquitoes. So we want to, you know, wear long sleeves and long pants whenever feasible, whenever possible. And of course, we all know about mosquito repellents. They are very effective, but I do like to make people aware of the fact that there is more than just DEET available on the market. If you don't like DEET, if you can't wear it for whatever reason, or if you just don't like the smell, I want to point you to this website. This is an EPA website that lists all, if not all, almost all current insect repellent products by the actual product name, and then the formulation, the effective ingredient, and whether it's effective against mosquitoes and ticks or both, and for how long. And there's actually 4 or 5, at least 4 active ingredients that are alternatives to DEET that work equally as well and are equally and have an equal amount of time that they're efficacious. So if you explore this tool, you might find some things. You might find more information that might be helpful to protect yourselves. So local municipalities actually do a lot in Ohio to protect us from mosquitoes, and this is even more so true in places like Florida, California, and Texas, where they have higher mosquito disease burden. So our local public health departments and mosquito control districts perform larval source reduction, meaning like eliminating places where larvae can develop. And I'll show you some examples of places that you can target on your own property to reduce mosquito numbers locally at your houses. But local public health departments actually treat bodies of water that are known to produce larvae all around Franklin County and the state of Ohio with larvicides to reduce mosquito development. They also treat catch basins. So when you're driving along the street and you see a sewer grate, at the bottom of that, so there's usually a pipe that goes down, and in many cases there's a sump at the bottom of that like catches debris and other stuff, but it can also hold standing water. And those can be really great places for mosquitoes to develop. Newer designs have eliminated that sump, and many of our sewers don't have that sump, but there are some areas of the city that still have that catch basin design. And the public health departments treat all of those catch basins actually yearly to prevent mosquito development inside those catch basins. If you notice that you have larvae, mosquito larvae, or if you see mosquito larvae in a body of water or a catch basin that's near your house, you can report it to your local public health department and they will treat with larvicide. I used to live in Baltimore, and there was a catch basin at the end of the street by my house, and I would just stand there and watch the Aedes albopictus fly out of the catch basin. I could see them and I could see the standing water. It was beyond frustrating. But also, so public health departments also conduct mosquito surveillance. So they're looking not only for the species of mosquitoes and when their numbers peak, and then also they screen those mosquitoes for arboviruses, especially so like West Nile virus, and then in other parts of the country they're looking for dengue, chikungunya, or Zika. Zika virus. And then when mosquitoes are particularly abundant, or when certain viruses are found to be present, so when there are certain thresholds that are met, then public health departments spray adulticides to knock down mosquito populations using truck-mounted ultra-low volume sprayers. So they drive through the streets and spray in a particular location where they detected a public health threat or where they got a complaint. All right, so if you want to prevent mosquitoes on your property, the key thing, so larval source reduction goes a long, long way. It has a longer lasting effect than treating with insecticides, like treating with adulticides, I should say. This is really, getting the mosquitoes at the source. So any standing water we want to get rid of. If you have a bird bath in your backyard, make sure you change the water weekly. And if you have a little brush, you might want to scrub the inside of that, and that can get some of those Aedes eggs off because they stick them on the side of the bird bath. And then things people don't often think about are their gutters. So if your gutters are full of leaves and then you get a rain, now you have a bunch of standing water right at your roof line, and mosquitoes love laying eggs in gutters. But yeah, so I think that's the last thing I wanted to say. I'm trying to think if there's any other. Oh, if you have a pond or any other small body of water, you can treat it with a biopesticide called Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis, and the brand name is Larval Dunks. So if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you can buy these and you just toss one in your pond, and it's relatively specific to mosquito larvae, so it's not going to kill other stuff, but I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. But that's something to do with if you have a body of water you can't drain. All right, before I take questions, I again just wanted to acknowledge the grant that lets me be here today. And then I'm asking, if possible, for you all to follow or to punch in the link at the bottom or take a picture of the QR code on your screen and follow that. Please fill out the survey. It's very short, and I really appreciate the feedback. And then I'm happy to take questions. I think we've got a bit